The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy, familiar creak, releasing a wave of muffled voices and shuffling footsteps from the hallway. For most people inside that building today was just another ordinary Tuesday. But for me, it marked the end of one life and the quiet beginning of another. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Nathan Hargrove, leaned in close enough that only I could hear his voice low-sharp and laced with unmistakable satisfaction. "Lost the house, didn't you? Useless." He didn't wait for a reply. A smug smirk spread across his face as he adjusted his expensive tie, the same one I had helped him pick out for important meetings years ago. Around us, lawyers hurried past with stacks of documents. A woman laughed too loudly at something her attorney said, and life moved on as though 22 years of marriage hadn't just been reduced to signatures on paper. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I calmly adjusted the sleeve of my navy coat, met his eyes for one steady second, and smiled a small, composed smile that didn't reach my eyes, but carried something far more dangerous certainty. Because Nathan had no idea what I had already done. We walked out of the courthouse side by side, an awkward formality that neither of us bothered to break. The April sky hung low and overcast, painting everything in dull shades of gray. Nathan paused at the top of the stone steps, pulling out his sunglasses, as if this were merely another successful business negotiation. "I'll have my assistant send over the timeline," he said, casually sliding the glasses on. 30 days should be more than enough for you to clear out your things." My gaze drifted past him to the parking lot where my car waited. "That won't be necessary." He let out a short, condescending laugh. "Still stubborn, Sophia. You don't have any leverage anymore. The house is mine, legally clean. You agreed to it in the settlement." "I remember exactly what I agreed to," I replied quietly. "Good," he said, clearly pleased with himself. "Then don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. The word almost made me want to laugh. Instead, I simply nodded once as though accepting defeat and began descending the steps. Nathan remained at the top for a moment longer, watching me. He was waiting for the breakdown, the tears, the anger, the desperate pleas. He had always been good at predicting my reactions. This time I gave him nothing. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel and allowed myself one long, slow breath. The tension I had carried for years felt lighter already, even if only slightly. I didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and let the reality settle in. 22 years. A beautiful colonial house in a prestigious suburb outside Boston. Holiday cards with perfect family photos. A daughter, Lily, now in college. From the outside, we had been the ideal couple. Stable, successful, enviable. But stability had come at a price, and I had finally decided I was no longer willing to pay it. I drove back to the house, technically still our house for now. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Nathan's car was already gone. Of course it was. He wouldn't want to linger after his victory. I stepped inside. The familiar scent of polished hardwood and faint citrus cleaner greeted me like an old acquaintance. Everything looked exactly the same, the wide windows letting in soft gray light, the elegant furniture, the carefully chosen artwork. Appearances could be remarkably resilient even when the foundation had already crumbled. I walked past the living room and down the hallway to the small study at the back, the one room Nathan rarely entered because paperwork bored him. I closed the door behind me, unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk, and took out a thin, unassuming folder. For a long moment I simply held it in my hands, feeling its weight. Then I opened it. Bank statements, investment portfolios, business registration documents, all under my name, all meticulously documented and legally separate. Years of quiet, disciplined work that Nathan had never bothered to notice. He believed I had walked away from the divorce with nothing. I closed the folder and allowed myself one small private smile. That night I didn't sleep in the house. I packed a suitcase with only the essentials and checked into a modest extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of town. The room was simple beige walls, a stiff queen bed, a small kitchenette, and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. I set my suitcase down and stood in the middle of the room listening to the silence. No heavy footsteps upstairs. No television blaring from the living room. No invisible pressure of expectations hanging in the air. Just space. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my reflection in the mirror across the room. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was performing. I didn't feel like I was shrinking to fit someone else's vision of who I should be. I was simply Sophia. And that was enough to begin again. People always assume they understand a marriage by looking at the surface. For 22 years, Nathan and I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. We lived in a stately colonial home in a quiet, upscale suburb outside Boston. The lawn was impeccably maintained, the wraparound porch furnished with tasteful wicker chairs, and every December our holiday cards arrived on time, featuring the three of us smiling in coordinated outfits. Nathan in his tailored suits, me in something elegant but understated, and our daughter Lily positioned perfectly between us. Colleagues, neighbors, and friends often remarked how solid we were. How lucky I was to have a husband like Nathan Hargrove. On paper, they were right. Nathan was successful, decisive, and financially secure. He had climbed the corporate ladder at a major investment firm with calculated precision. He provided well. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries. He never raised his voice in public. But control, I learned, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Nathan's control was subtle and refined. He didn't need to demand. He simply arranged everything so that his way became the only reasonable path. Finances were easier when handled by him. Major decisions were discussed, but somehow always aligned with his vision. Even our social life revolved around his network and schedule. For a long time I convinced myself this was love, that his need to manage was a form of protection. Until it wasn't. The first real cracks appeared quietly, the way most marriages begin to unravel. Small inconsistencies. Late nights at the office that stretched later and later. Phone calls taken in the garage. The way he started looking at his reflection with a renewed sense of pride, the kind that suggested someone else was noticing him too. I didn't accuse him immediately. Accusations would have triggered his defenses and made him even more vigilant. Instead, I watched. I listened. I noted patterns. And then I began to prepare. It started small, almost innocently. While Nathan was busy with a major merger at work, I took on freelance financial consulting projects. At first, it was just helping a few friends of friends with retirement planning and budget restructuring after career changes. Nathan knew about it, but he dismissed it as a hobby to keep you occupied. That underestimation became my greatest advantage. Those early earnings went into a separate account he had never asked about. I chose a different bank, used my maiden name on some documents when possible, and kept meticulous records. Over time, I educated myself reading books, taking online courses in investment strategy, and quietly consulting with professionals who owed me no loyalty to Nathan. I learned how to structure assets so they remained legally separate even after years of marriage. I wasn't planning to leave at first. I was simply creating a safety net in a marriage where everything had slowly drifted into his control. Then, 2.5 years ago, I discovered the affair. Her name was Elena. She was 34, ambitious, and worked in marketing at a client company. I found out through a combination of credit card statements, hotel charges, and a few carefully worded conversations with people in his circle who didn't realize how much they were revealing. The evidence was clear but not dramatic. No tearful confessions, no lipstick on collars, just the slow, deliberate erosion of whatever remained of our intimacy. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store for nearly an hour after confirming the last piece of evidence. I waited for the wave of rage or heartbreak to crash over me. It never came. What I felt instead was a strange, cold clarity. This wasn't a betrayal that happened overnight. It was the natural conclusion of years in which I had become background in my own marriage. Nathan no longer saw me as a partner. He saw me as a comfortable constant, someone who would always be there to maintain the image he had worked so hard to build. So I made a choice. I would not confront him. I would not cry or demand explanations. That would only give him the opportunity to manipulate the narrative to smooth things over, or to tighten his financial control even further. Instead, I accelerated my plan. I increased my freelance work, diversified my investments, and began the process of registering my own consulting business under my name only. Every transfer was documented, every investment decision was made independently. I consulted a sharp family law attorney, Margaret Klein, in secret, and followed her guidance meticulously. The goal was never revenge, it was independence. Nathan, meanwhile, continued living as though nothing had changed. He talked about our future retirement plans, traveling once Lily graduated, maybe buying a vacation home. He still believed I was the same Sophia who had spent 2 decades adapting to his rhythm. He had no idea I had already stepped out of it. By the time he finally sat me down in the living room one rainy evening and told me he wanted a divorce, citing growing apart, and wanting different things, I was ready. He spoke gently, almost magnanimously, outlining a settlement that heavily favored him. The house, the majority of investments, even the retirement accounts he assumed were entirely under his management. I listened quietly, nodding at the right moments. Inside, I was already several moves ahead. When he finished, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same hand he hadn't held with genuine affection in years. "We can do this amicably, Sophia, for Lily's sake." I looked at him and smiled the same way I had smiled leaving the courthouse. "Yes," I said softly, "we can." He never noticed the folder waiting in my study or the new chapter I had already begun writing. The first few mornings in the hotel room felt strangely surreal. I woke up to silence instead of the familiar creak of Nathan's footsteps downstairs or the distant hum of the garage door opening. There was no need to check my appearance before leaving the bedroom, no invisible pressure to have coffee ready at exactly the right time, and no calculated conversations about his day ahead. For the first time in over 2 decades, my mornings belonged to me. I spent the initial days adjusting to this new quiet. I took long showers without worrying about hot water, read the news slowly with a cup of tea, and allowed myself to sit with my thoughts instead of constantly managing someone else's mood. The modest room with its beige walls and functional furniture began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a cocoon, a safe space where I could finally stretch. On the 3rd morning, I called Margaret Klein, my attorney. "Good morning, Sophia," she answered warmly. "I was expecting your call." "How does it look?" I asked, standing by the small window overlooking the parking lot. "Better than expected. Nathan is still very confident, which works in our favor. His team is proceeding under the assumption that you have very little independent assets. They're already preparing the asset division papers based on that belief." I smiled faintly. "Let them." We reviewed the timeline and next steps. Margaret was sharp, meticulous, and had been worth every discreet consultation fee I had paid her over the past year. She confirmed that all my documentation was solid. The freelance income, the investment accounts, and the business registration were all properly separated and traceable. After hanging up, I felt a quiet surge of momentum. Later that morning, I drove across town to meet Michael Pierce at his financial consulting firm. The office was tucked between a cozy bakery and a small law practice professional, but not intimidating. Michael, a calm man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted me with a firm handshake. "Sophia Reynolds," he said, using my new preferred name. "I've reviewed the documents you sent. Very thorough work." We spent nearly 2 hours going over my current portfolio, projected cash flow, and long-term strategy. Unlike Nathan, who often spoke over me when discussing money, Michael listened carefully and offered thoughtful suggestions without condescension. We talked about expanding my own consulting practice, helping women in transitional phases of life navigate their finances during divorce, career changes, or widowhood. By the time I left his office, I had a clear action plan, and more importantly, a sense of genuine partnership. That afternoon, while driving back toward the hotel, something caught my eye. On a quiet corner street lined with mature trees, a small single-story office space displayed a for-lease sign. I slowed down, then pulled over. The building was modest, but charming wide front windows, a neat brick walkway, and enough space for a reception area and 2 private offices. It wasn't flashy, but it felt right. I sat in the car for several minutes, imagining my name on the door, Sophia Reynolds Financial Consulting. I called the number on the sign before I could second-guess myself. The landlord answered on the second ring. We arranged to meet the next morning for a viewing. That night, back in the hotel room, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself, really looked. There were fine lines around my eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago. My hair had a few more silver strands. But my posture was straighter, my gaze clearer. I wasn't starting over as a broken woman trying to survive. I was starting as someone who had finally chosen herself. The next morning I signed the lease. The process was surprisingly simple. Within an hour I had the keys in my hand and a move-in date for the following week. As I walked through the empty space, sunlight streaming across the hardwood floors, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the moment. This was real, no longer hidden in folders or secret accounts. This was visible, tangible, mine. I spent the rest of the day making lists, basic furniture I would need, supplies, a simple website draft. In the evening, I received a message from Nathan. "Where are you staying? We still need to discuss a few things." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "I'll be in touch through Margaret when necessary." I turned off my phone and went to sleep early. For the first time in years, my dreams weren't filled with anxiety about maintaining an image or anticipating someone else's needs. They were quiet, steady, and entirely my own. The first morning in my new office was quiet, almost ordinary, yet it felt like the most significant day I had experienced in years. I arrived at 7:45 a.m., carrying a box containing a new coffee maker, a few notebooks, and a small potted plant. The space was still mostly empty hardwood floors, wide windows letting in generous morning light, and white walls that smelled faintly of fresh paint. It was modest, but it was entirely mine. I spent the first 2 hours arranging things with care: a simple wooden desk positioned to face the window, 2 comfortable client chairs, a low bookshelf for reference materials. I hung a single piece of abstract art on the wall, something colorful and hopeful that I had bought the day before. No expensive decorations, no attempt to impress, just a clean professional space that reflected clarity and calm. By 10 a.m., the office no longer felt empty, it felt purposeful. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began reaching out to former colleagues and acquaintances I had quietly maintained contact with over the years. My message was straightforward. I had launched my own financial consulting practice specializing in transitional planning for women navigating major life changes. Within hours, responses started coming in. Some were surprised, others genuinely supportive. A few promised to refer clients. Around 11:30, my first official client walked through the door. Laura Bennett was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed, but carrying visible tension in her shoulders. She held a leather folder tightly against her chest, as if it contained fragile evidence of her entire life. "Ms. Reynolds?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "Please call me Sophia," I said with a warm smile, standing to greet her. "Come in." We settled into the chairs. I offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully. For the first few minutes, she spoke carefully about her situation. Her husband of 28 years had suddenly announced he wanted a divorce. He had always managed all the finances. She had trusted him completely. Now she feared she might lose everything she had helped build. I listened without interrupting, letting her tell her story at her own pace. When she finished, I leaned forward slightly. "Laura, let's start with what we can prove, not what you've been told. May I see the documents you brought?" For the next 90 minutes, we went through her papers, line by line. I showed her how to read between the numbers: retirement accounts that had been moved, expenses that didn't add up, assets that had been quietly restructured. I explained concepts simply but without condescension, highlighting what belonged to her under the law and what steps she could take immediately to protect herself. At one point, Laura's eyes welled up. "I feel so stupid," she whispered. "I trusted him with everything." "You're not stupid," I said gently but firmly. "You were loyal in a marriage that rewarded your trust with control. That's not the same thing." She looked at me for a long moment, searching my face. "How do you know all this so well?" I paused, then gave her a small, honest smile. "Because I've lived it." And I chose not to stay there. By the end of the session, Laura's posture had changed. Her questions became sharper, her notes more detailed. She left with a clear action list, a list of recommended professionals, and most importantly, a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. After she left, I sat at my desk for a while, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why I had built all of this. Not just for myself, but to help other women avoid the helplessness I had once felt. That afternoon, as I was updating client notes, my phone vibrated. A message from Nathan. "I heard you leased an office space. We need to talk. This is getting ridiculous." I read the message twice, feeling neither anger nor triumph, only quiet amusement. He was starting to realize that the narrative he had written in his head was no longer accurate. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I finished my work, locked the office door, and drove back to the hotel. On the way, I stopped at a small florist and bought a simple bouquet of white lilies for my new desk. That evening, I finally replied to Nathan with one short message: "I'm available through my attorney if it's about the settlement. Otherwise, I suggest we both focus on moving forward." I turned off my phone, made myself a simple dinner in the hotel kitchenette, and reviewed the notes from Laura's session. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I was actively building. By the end of that first week, I had 3 confirmed clients. The office was no longer just a hope, it was becoming a reality, one consultation at a time. And Nathan, for all his control and confidence, was finally beginning to understand that he no longer held all the pieces. 3 days after I signed the lease on my office, Nathan sent a message. "We should talk. There are things to settle. Noon tomorrow. Westbrook Grill." It wasn't a request. It was the same commanding tone he had used for 22 years, assuming I would show up, sit down, and follow his lead. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But then I realized this was an opportunity. I replied with 2 simple words: "I'll be there." Westbrook Grill was the kind of restaurant Nathan loved. Polished, dark wood, soft jazz playing in the background, waiters who moved like shadows and knew when to disappear. It smelled of aged steak butter and quiet power. The kind of place where deals were made and egos were stroked. When I arrived, he was already seated at a corner table as expected. He always preferred to be the one waiting. He looked up as I approached, his expression carefully composed, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Sophia," he said, standing briefly as I sat down. "You look different." "I feel different," I replied calmly, unfolding my napkin. He ordered a glass of Cabernet without asking my preference, the same way he had done for years. I ordered sparkling water and the grilled salmon. Small acts of independence, but they mattered to me now. For the first few minutes, we exchanged surface-level conversation, mostly about Lily and her upcoming exams. Then Nathan leaned forward, getting to the point. "I thought we could handle this like adults," he said. "But I've heard some concerning things. You leased an office, started some kind of consulting business." I met his gaze steadily. "Yes." He let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "Sophia, this is unnecessary. I'm prepared to be more than fair in the settlement. You don't need to put on this show. This isn't a show, Nathan." He studied me for a long moment, as if trying to find the version of me he used to know, the one who would eventually yield. "I've had my attorney prepare a revised offer," he continued, sliding a folder across the table. "Significantly better than the original. The house can be sold and proceeds split. You'll receive a generous monthly support payment. You can keep your car, of course." I didn't open the folder. Instead, I reached into my own bag and placed a thinner, neatly organized folder on the table between us. "What's that?" he asked, his tone shifting. "Context," I said simply. Nathan opened it. As his eyes moved across the first few pages, account statements, investment summaries, business registration documents, his expression changed from confidence to disbelief, then to barely contained anger. "What the hell is this?" His voice dropped, but the sharpness was unmistakable. "You've been hiding assets." "I haven't hidden anything," I replied evenly. "I built them, independently, over several years. Everything is properly documented and legally separate." He flipped through the pages faster, his fingers tightening on the paper. "This is during our marriage. Anything acquired?" "Was acquired with my own earnings from legitimate freelance work," I interrupted calmly. "You can have your lawyers review it. They'll find it's airtight." The waiter arrived with our food, but the tension at the table made him retreat quickly. Nathan barely glanced at his steak. "You planned this," he said, voice low. While we were still living together, while you were building your new life with Elena, I said quietly. He froze. For the first time in our entire marriage, Nathan Hargrove looked genuinely caught off guard. You knew I've known for over 2 years. He leaned back in his chair, staring at me as though seeing a stranger. And you said nothing. You just schemed in the background. I didn't scheme, Nathan. I prepared. There's a difference. I watched you slowly erase me from your life and decided I wouldn't let you erase my future as well. Silence stretched between us. The soft jazz in the background felt almost mocking now. You could have talked to me, he said finally. I did, I replied. Many times. About feeling invisible, about wanting more partnership, about the distance growing between us. You always had an answer: work, stress, my overthinking, the need to maintain stability. You never actually listened. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of agitation. So this is your revenge, destroying everything we built. This isn't revenge. This is me refusing to be left with nothing after giving 22 years of my life. He looked down at the folder again, his jaw clenched. You've changed. No, I said softly. I've simply stopped pretending. The rest of the meal passed in heavy silence. Nathan barely touched his food. I ate slowly, deliberately refusing to rush or show discomfort. When the check arrived, he paid out of habit, but his usual confidence was fractured. As we stood to leave, he looked at me one last time. This isn't over, Sophia. My lawyers will fight this. I expect nothing less, I said, but I suggest you tell them to review the documents carefully. Dragging this out will only cost you more time and money. I walked out of the restaurant first, the afternoon sun warm on my face. I didn't look back. For the first time in our long marriage, Nathan Hargrove was the one left standing in uncertainty, watching me walk away. 2 days after the tense lunch at Westbrook Grill, Nathan showed up at my office without warning. I was reviewing notes from a morning consultation when I heard the firm knock on the glass door. Through the blinds, I saw his familiar silhouette. I took a slow breath, then called out calmly, "Come in." Nathan stepped inside, his eyes sweeping across the space, the simple desk, the client chairs, the fresh lilies on the side table, my name neatly printed on the door. He was dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks, but his usual commanding presence felt slightly diminished in this new environment. "So this is it," he said, closing the door behind him. "Your new empire." "It's a start," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Sit down, Nathan." He didn't sit immediately. He walked around the small office, touching the edge of the bookshelf, looking out the window as if searching for something to criticize. Finally, he sat down, placing a new folder on the desk between us. "I have a revised settlement offer," he said without preamble. "A much better one. You'll get 40% of the house proceeds, a substantial lump sum, and continued health insurance coverage for 3 years. In return, we end this cleanly. No more surprises." I glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "You're adjusting your position," I noted. "I'm being reasonable," he replied, his tone tightening. "You've made your point, Sophia. There's no need to drag this out and damage both of us." I leaned back, slightly studying him. The man sitting in front of me was no longer the completely confident Nathan I had lived with for 22 years. There were cracks in his armor now. "I'm not interested in dragging anything out," I said. "But I also won't sign something just because it's convenient for you. Everything will go through the proper legal process." Nathan's jaw flexed. "You're really going to make this difficult, aren't you?" "No," I said evenly. "I'm being precise. There's a difference." He exhaled sharply and leaned forward. "My lawyer says there are inconsistencies in your documentation. We can challenge the classification of those assets." "You're welcome to try," I replied. "But I suggest you save your money. Every transfer, every account, every decision was made independently and properly recorded. Margaret has already prepared responses to whatever your team is planning." For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner. Nathan stared at me, searching for any sign of hesitation or bluff. He found none. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Long enough, I said. I started preparing seriously about 2.5 years ago after I confirmed the affair. He winced slightly at the word, but didn't deny it. You could have come to me, he said. We could have worked through it. I tried, Nathan, for years, but you were too busy controlling the narrative to actually hear me. You saw a supportive wife who would always adapt. You stopped seeing me as a person with her own needs and ambitions. He looked down at his hands for a long moment. When he spoke again, there was a rawness in his voice I hadn't heard in a very long time. I didn't think you had it in you, he admitted, to build all this behind my back, to be this prepared. I know, I said softly. That's exactly why it worked. Nathan rubbed his face, then looked around the office once more. You're really doing this, building a new life. Without me. Yes. He was silent for nearly a minute. Then, almost reluctantly, he spoke the words I never expected to hear from him. I underestimated you, Sophia. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to genuine acknowledgement he had ever given me. Yes, you did, I replied. But this isn't about winning or losing anymore. It's about me finally choosing myself. Nathan nodded slowly, as if processing the reality for the first time. He stood up, leaving the revised offer on the desk. I'll have my attorney coordinate with Margaret, he said. We'll proceed properly. At the door, he paused and turned back. For what it's worth, you're good at this. The office, the way you carry yourself now. All of it. I didn't need his validation, but I accepted the words for what they were, a small surrender. Thank you, I said. He gave a short, tired nod and walked out. I remained seated for a long time after the door closed, listening to the quiet hum of my office. There was no explosion of triumph, no overwhelming rush of victory, just a deep, steady sense of alignment. The woman who had spent 22 years adapting had finally stopped, and the woman who was ready to build was now fully in charge. 1 month later, my small office was no longer just a beginning. It had become a living, breathing space of purpose. The once empty shelves now held client files and reference books. The calendar on my desk was filled with appointments. Word had spread quietly through Margaret's network and Michael's referrals. I now had 7 active clients, women in different stages of transition, each carrying their own fears and hopes, much like I once had. Every consultation reminded me why I had fought so hard for this independence. Guiding them through financial clarity, helping them see their own worth beyond their marriages, it was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. One Thursday afternoon, as golden sunlight poured through the front windows, my phone rang. It was Lily. Mom, her voice came through warm and bright. I just finished my last exam. How are you? Really? I smiled, leaning back in my chair. I'm good, sweetheart. Better than good, actually. There was a short pause. Dad called me yesterday. He sounded different, more subdued. He said you've started your own business. I have, I replied honestly. A financial consulting practice focused on women going through major life changes. Lily let out a soft laugh, one filled with both surprise and pride. I knew you were up to something. You always were the quiet planner. I'm really proud of you, Mom. I mean it. Her words touched me deeply. For so long I had worried about how the divorce would affect her. But Lily, now 20 years old and wiser than her years, understood more than I had given her credit for. I'm proud of you too, I said, for supporting both of us even when it wasn't easy. We'll be okay, she replied gently. All 3 of us. Just in different ways now. After we hung up, I stood up and walked to the front window. The street outside was peaceful, lined with mature trees swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. I thought about the long road that had brought me here, the silent years of preparation, the heartbreak I had chosen not to drown in the courage it took to build something new at 51 years old. Nathan and I had finalized the settlement 2 weeks ago. It was fair. Not because he suddenly became generous, but because my documentation left him with little choice. He kept the house. I kept my independence and a substantial portion of the assets I had built. We were no longer enemies, just two people whose paths had finally diverged. The late afternoon light stretched long across the hardwood floor of my office. I walked back to my desk and opened the thin folder that had once been hidden in the back drawer of our old home. Now it sat openly, filled with new plans, expanding my client base, creating online workshops, perhaps even writing a small guide for women starting over. I closed the folder and rested my hand on it for a moment. This wasn't the ending I had imagined 22 years ago when I said I do, but it was the beginning I had chosen for myself. I looked around the quiet office at the name on the door that belonged only to me, and allowed myself a genuine, peaceful smile. One step ahead, not to win, but to live. And for the first time in a very long time, I was truly ready for whatever came next.